Hi, it's Mark back with another Photoshop tutorial and Lightroom, come to think of it. We're going to be looking at HDR. Do you know what HDR stands for? It stands for horrible, drastic, and it's ruined. And you can get pictures which look a bit like that, which is not very good at all. And to be fair, it's a bit over the top. This picture could have benefited from HDR because there was a lot of blown out pieces which would be nice to subdue, and there was a lot of detail in the shadows which would be nice to bring out. And that's the essence of HDR, if you didn't know. It's often called bracketing, where you take a photograph, you take the same photograph again underexposed. So because it's underexposed, all the real brights are subdued, and then you take a one that's overexposed, and because it's overexposed, all the shadows are actually lifted and lightened. So if you take the lightened shadows from one and the subdued highlights from the other and stir them together, you get an HDR image. That's the essence of what we're going to be doing. Now, Photoshop and Lightroom come with the ability to do HDRs for you, and I'm going to show you how that works. But I'm not entirely a fan of it. I'm not a fan of HDR, but I'm not a fan of Photoshop's and Lightroom's own internal way of doing it because they do the whole picture. Now, bad as that picture was I've just showed you, and I've titled it bad as it was, if we toned some of that down and possibly just brought some out in the details on parts and did not have it in the sky and every single piece of gravel and everything, we might have had a better picture. So we're going to culminate this video by doing a manual HDR. So we're going to be in charge of which part of which we use, and I think we'll end up with a better picture because of it. The pictures we're going to use today do not include this because this was just a single shot. The pictures we use today, I went out this morning to take. I popped into Newcastle and took a few pictures which I'll put in a link down below from our website, and you can download those. They are raw files, not JPEGs, so it's a little bit heavier in size, but if you can download them, get them loaded in Lightroom, get them ready to load them into Photoshop. I'll meet you on the other side of the titles, and we shall get cracking. So here we are, first and foremost in Lightroom, and the three pictures I just took through the arch towards the castle, and then we'll have a play with this one as well, which I just took in the living room. So this was the correct exposure one, generally, according to my camera, including, I've just noticed there, someone's empty lager tin. Oh well, there we go. And this one is the underexposed one, which essentially is to get rid of any unwanted highlights. And if we jump back, that would kind of be here, although I don't think that's bad in this picture, but it's there as demonstration anyway. And then the third picture is the overexposed one, where you can see just on this one alone lots more detail in the brickwork, but we've really lost it here. And if we go back to the normal exposure, yes, you don't actually have that detail in the brickwork. So that's what we're going to use first, and we're going to use Lightroom's inbuilt version of HDR. So we'll click and highlight all three, and then right click and choose Photo Merge HDR. You can also do Control H to actually load this next dialog box. Incidentally, if your dialog box isn't this big, it's one of the few ones where you can actually resize, and I think when you're doing something like this, it's good to have them resize. Now, what we've got here is auto align and auto settings. So auto align, obvious, your picture might not be exactly the same, so it will use key lines, perhaps these verticals and the arch, and it'll do its best job to actually align those pictures if they weren't rock steady on a tripod and not moving. The next thing is ghosting. Now let's assume we had a pigeon. Well, it's Newcastle, isn't it? And it's all bricks, so let's have a pigeon walking across the road here. Photoshop can auto align the picture, but it can't auto align the pigeon. So it does its best to try and give a single representation of things like that. And in doing so, there can be elements of ghosting. And the way to combat that is by how much ghost amount you apply. I usually don't have that problem. It's not so. I would probably get rid of the pigeon first, but that's just me. and I generally leave it on low, but they are to taste. So there's no harm in actually clicking on them. The point is me clicking on them now because there's nothing really that applies to. So that's your ghosting or de-ghosting amount. Now, auto settings. I'm going to switch that off and switch back on. So you can see fundamentally there is a massive difference. But what exactly does auto settings do? Well, let's click on merge, see what happens, and I'll show you what it does. Alright, so here's our merged document. You can see the name has been generated with HDR, and it's now a DNG file as opposed to the raw file. And to the form, it's not a bad job, this one, bringing out the shadows and subduing some of the lights. That does not, to me, look over the top on HDR, and despite some of my earlier reservations about it, this isn't a bad job. However, what did auto actually do? Well, let's press D for develop settings, shall we? And let's have a look at what it's done. So I'm going to take a screenshot here, so bear with me while I just take a little screenshot of those. Now I've done the screenshot, what I'm going to do is click on reset, so it undoes those changes, and immediately the first thing to notice is there's a border. It's not really a border, it's, remember when we auto-aligned things, I said they might not fit, and Photoshop, sorry, Lightroom would actually do a bit of a crop on it. Well, that's what it's done, just to hide those. But now let us click on auto, as if there was a picture we've just opened up. First thing we're going to do on our editing is click on auto and see what it does. And if I now bring this screenshot back in, you can see that they're not exactly the same. So exposure 1.2 when I clicked on it there, 1.5 before, plus 7 on the contrast, minus 81 versus minus 84, plus 75, plus 80. It's in real close ballpark. So what we've just proven there is that when we did that merger, that button which says auto tone is virtually the same as clicking auto. In either way, it doesn't matter because these are non-destructive. So whether you like what it did or didn't like what it did, you can still come in and start to play with this picture. So there you go. That's how you would do it initially in Lightroom. We'll now jump over and do similar in Photoshop. So here we are in Photoshop, sunny as always, and we go to File, Automate, and Merge to HDR Pro. There are a few ways of doing this, but I'm just using this particular method. And we'll browse for the files. They're in my Downloads folder, and the first ones with the castles were these three. So let's open those. There they are, and click OK. And attempt to automatically align source images. I would generally leave that as yes. Alright, so what's happening now is it's loading each individual layer, and as it does so, you'll see the layers over in this corner build up. And then once it's done the loading of the 3 layers, it will actually open up the HDR Pro dialog box for us to see, which could be any day yet. Here we go, right, it's loaded the 3 layers, it's done the alignment on them, and here we are with the window. Now you can't see all of this window because it's wider than what I'm filming, so if I just bear with me while I just change the size of this dialog box and drag it all in. There you are. And we'll just zoom in to whatever the maximum percentage is it lets us, which is 200. So here are our 3 pictures, and as you can see down here, this is interesting. This was the original, and to the right you can see that it was minus 2 stops, and to the left it was almost plus 2 stops. I don't know why it's shy of 2 stops, but there we go, it's plus 1.97. I wonder if that is a bug somewhere. And we've got this dialog box. Now there are 2 versions of this dialog box. there's the 16-bit and 8-bit, which look the same, and then there's the 32-bit, which looks fundamentally different. So let's just deal with them one at a time. We're on 32-bit, so let's stay on 32-bit. You have the option for removing ghosts. And what it says here is, it says complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw. Now I can take that off and let's click OK and see what it does. And we'll do this again. And I've clicked OK on merging. And there's our merged file. There's not a lot of detail has come out there. It has subdued the highlights. It's fairly flat. So remember, I'm deliberately not doing anything at all with this picture. We can then go on to edit it in Adobe Camera Raw. Let's just kill that. Don't save. So incidentally, when I did this just as a practice run, I felt I was forced to jump back and redo, like I'm doing now, because there wasn't a back out button as such. So I'll just fast forward this a little bit. Okay, so this time we're sitting in Photoshop. We do want to complete the toning in Adobe Camera Raw. Just need to raise that up again for you. And so we'll click on Tone in ACR. Now Adobe Camera Raw is just Lightroom with a different UI on the front. And so once this loads the picture for us, there's a temp version there, it will then load Adobe Camera Raw. And here we are. And again, when you're in Adobe Camera Raw, you can of course click on Auto and let it do its thing. Alright, so I'm not going to concentrate too much on the actual edit of it. I just wanted to show you and play through the options. But again, it's the whole picture. To every pixel of colour, the whole lot has been treated as an HDR picture. So that was the 32-bit version. I'll just speed up and reload and we'll go to the next one. So here we are, I've loaded them up, and this time I selected the 16-bit version. So what have we got? We've got Edge Glow, we've got Tone and Detail, we've got Advanced, which has got some shadows, highlights, vibrance and saturation, and we've also got a tone curve, very reminiscent of the curves adjustment layer and the tone curve that you see in Lightroom. So all these can be adjusted to taste, to play with your picture. Of course, it is across the whole screen. There is no masking at this particular stage, so you'd have to just bear with on that one. But what exactly is Edge Glow? Okay, well, Edge Glow for me is all about sharpening. In HDR, you do get very bold edges. Now, I've got a tutorial all about the different ways of sharpening in Photoshop and Lightroom, which are linked to above now. But essentially, sharpening is Photoshop or Lightroom finding where it thinks edges are. And edges are dictated by the amount of change between two pixels. So for example, here we've got a very bold, very dark set of pixels, and if you move over to the right 1 or 2 pixels, you find that they start to become very light. Now you can set in sharpening how big a step you want that to be, so that would definitely be classed as an edge, but that one wouldn't, because the pixels aren't too different. This is what we're talking about here. So the strength is about how much variance you actually want to dictate whether or not we actually have an edge. And then the radius is how wide a set of pixels do you want that to be applied to. And as we move across the radius, you can see how this edge is getting more and more impacted. I'm just picking on this one because it is the most obvious one. But do you know what? It doesn't really matter what these are called. The thing, and it doesn't matter what the values are, because no one could say you should use 63, because every single picture will be different. So these are just 2 sliders that interact with each other when it comes to adjusting what you see on the screen. And despite what they're called and despite what the numbers are, you should be looking here when you're adjusting them, because it's for your eye that is the most important thing. Tone, well, we obviously know what exposure is, and detail. So that's a bit like your clarity type effect or your texture effect if you're in Lightroom. So gamma is another form of adjustment, and how this works is if you go to 1, dynamic range is absolutely maximized, and doesn't it look awful? So lower settings will actually emphasize midtones, and the higher settings emphasize highlights and shadows. So 1 is at absolute maximum, which is awful, and as you come down here, you're talking about midtones, and as you go up, you're getting a combination of highlights and shadows. But again, it is just a slider. Doesn't matter what it's called. You know it's just part of tone and detail. You shouldn't be worried about that. You should be watching over here while you actually make those adjustments. And the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noted that there's a drop down here which says local adaptation. Local adaptation is all the HDR adjustments, the tonality and such, by using brightness regions throughout the picture. But there are other things you can choose, and be wary, these aren't going to look good. So equalize histogram. Equalize histogram compresses the whole dynamic range of the image, but it tries to preserve or major on contrast. This is an automatic one. We don't get any sliders, I don't think. There you are. So that's what equalize histogram does. Exposure and gamma gives a bit more manual adjustment to brightness and contrast, and you move the sliders to adjust to suit. We already know exposure, it's intuitive, and gamma we've already mentioned, but these are just bringing these out as separate entities. Normally on tools in Photoshop and Lightroom, double clicking on them does a reset. These aren't. I should have tried to remember where they were when we first came over. Probably 1 and 1. So I'll just stick that to 1. I'll stick that to 1. And the final one we've got is highlight compression. Now highlight compression, guess what it does? It gets the highlights and it compresses them, so they fall within the right luminosity ranges of the image that you have. And again, it's automatic. It could be, for example, you have a 32-bit image and you're working in 16-bit. Because the 32-bit image has got a lot more detail and range values for tonality, for color, for saturation and luminance and so on. When you're working in 16-bit, your picture might be above and beyond what 16-bit can deliver. So in doing the 16-bit highlight compression, it brings things back down into line because you're working in 16-bit and your image might be 32. That's part of the theory anyway. So there you go, and we're just going to click on OK. And there's our image. Again, looking a bit too HDR for my liking. Certainly around these edges here. But this is where we'd want to then make adjustments. But notice, this wouldn't be so bad if we still had the original picture there and aligned, and we could have masked it and automatically start to blend it. So it's a shame that that isn't there for reference, that this is not put as an additional layer on top of the first document that Photoshop loaded, which had the layers in. This would be a much better tool in my book if, oh sorry, that's my signature brush there. It'd be a much better tool in my book if the result of this was our stack and then this on top. But no, we've now committed to this, and that's the other reason I do not like the automatic HDR versions, be it 16 or 32-bit, and would prefer to do by hand. So let's have a look at doing some of this by hand, shall we? Jump back to Lightroom. So we are back in Lightroom just because I want to go and grab these three pictures. I'm going to right click and I'm going to set edit in and come out here and say open as layers in Photoshop. Incidentally, you had the merged HDR Pro in Photoshop. I said there were more than one ways of doing this, and I just stuck with that other version should you want to just go direct to Photoshop. But getting them in there wasn't the important part of this. Okay, so now we're in here. So we've got this one, which was the overexposed, so we're going to use that to pick our shadows from. We've got this one, which was that was our base picture, and we've got this one, which was our underexposed, which we're going to use to pick our highlights from. And what I like to do is put the base on the bottom, and I'm going to mask each of these out. So I'm holding down my Option or Alt key while I click on a mask on that one and on that one. Now I'm going to start with the highs. So click on my mask, B for brush tool, D for default colors. Right, so we now got white, so white is going to reveal some of what we've got here. So we can actually use that brush there. It's too hard a brush, sorry, that was my mistake. So I'll just soften it. You see, I was talking and got distracted, and I'll Control Z to get rid of those brush strokes, and we'll come in again and start brushing away. I'm doing this deliberately, by the way, because what we have here is ghosting. You see? So let's undo that. And let's hide those layers. Click all three and say, dear Photoshop, please auto align these layers. And click auto and OK. And off it goes, and it's aligned those layers. And you can see this is the border problem we saw before, which would need cropping out. So we're not going to bother cropping that out at the moment. Just want to click in here, switch those off, and get back where we were. So now we're in highlights, and now I start to brush again. You see, there's no ghosting now on that. So I'm just going to bring that down. Much more control. I'll bring those down and also take a little bit out the top of that rose. That's where I want to major on, I suppose. And then in the shadows, I've still got my white brush. Just want to bring out some. As you can see what we're doing here. So I'm using the shadow one to bring through some of the detail that was in the shadows, and I'm using the highlights one to fix those. And I'm going to bump the flow and opacity up there, make these a bit bigger, and just put a little bit of a vignette in as well, stroking the corners there. Alright, so as opposed to our original, which was there, we're now starting to see the benefits of adding our own HDR manually. And that's it. This isn't an edit about how to make this particular picture look good. I think that as it looks now is an improvement on what was the camera originally thought was straight at the box picture. We're getting there. We're also using this to add some other effects, such as where we started to add a little vignette and such. So that's why I think you should go for a manual approach to this. And don't forget, with HDR, you can set your camera to bracket usually on 3 pictures, 5 pictures, and so on. And that is the benefit of doing this. An HDR picture will never look cartoony and over the top using this method unless you really want it to. Whereas with the other tools, you're kind of stuck. if it weren't for that one thing that Adobe could do, which would give you a great choice, and that is to retain the original layer stack with the HDR one to blend in and mask. You could argue we do that anyway. We could have saved that previous one, brought it in as another layer, added to align it. But Adobe already give you these. When you focus stack, you find that all the remaining layers actually stay there with their individual masks when it does a photo stack, and it puts the resulting one on top. So you can go and cherry pick. But no, it's a little bit of inconsistency. Anyway, that's it. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please consider clicking on the subscribe button, and it helps me grow the channel, and give me a thumbs up if it wants a thumbs up. If it wants a thumbs down, please let me know why, so I can read your comments and take on board suggestions to improve content for you guys. And that's it. So I'm going to go. Enjoy. Bye now.